All right, welcome everyone. We're very pleased to have so many of you with us for today's episode of This Is CDR. This Is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal or CDR solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals that OpenAir is advancing throughout the US as well as in Europe. Everyone, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're zooming in from. I'm Megha Raghavan. I'm an OpenAir member based in the UK and California. Quick just background on OpenAir. So OpenAir is a distributed volunteer network dedicated to advancing the responsible deployment of carbon dioxide removal solutions, which are essential to solving the climate crisis. We have a growing global community which collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of R&D, policy advocacy, and CDR market development. We'll put some links to our website and our Twitter in the chat, so please do follow and join us there. So these are a few of the missions. You'll see them on the website as well. If you're interested in any of them or in starting your own mission, check them out and get in touch if you're kind of interested in leading the charge on any of those. All right, so most of you are familiar with carbon dioxide removal, which we and the IPCC define as anthropogenic methods of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it safely and for a long period of time in the geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs, or in long-lived products. So when we're considering CDR as we are today and with this series, it's really important to emphasize that CDR is not in any way an alternative to reducing emissions. We really need to reduce global emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly as possible and as completely as possible, full stop. That being said, there's a clear scientific consensus, including in very stark terms in the most recent IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 report, that CDR will be required at the gigaton scale, so billions of tons per year, by mid-century in order to counteract those emissions that are either difficult or inequitable to abate, and to ultimately start removing the tremendous excess of anthropogenic CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, so we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. If you're new to This Is CDR or to CDR in general, our previous episodes are a perfect place to start learning. So we'll put a link to those on OpenAir's YouTube channel in the chat, as well as a link to the CDR primer, which is a great and comprehensive resource if you're learning more about CDR. And of course, we're here to learn more, so we'll be continuing these sessions on an ongoing basis. And today, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Tank, who will introduce our presenters. So Tank, over to you.
Thank you, Megha. Hi, everyone. My name is Tang. I'm an OpenAir member based in Taiwan, and I work on communications. Some housekeeping notes before we begin. Our format will be a short presentation, followed by a few prepared questions, then moderated audience Q&A. So please type any questions you have in the StreamYard's comment box. Also, this event is being recorded. We will send the video link to everyone who register and also post to OpenAir's website and YouTube channel. This week, we're excited to welcome Stacy Kauk, Neil Hacker of Isometric. Neil leads research and partnership at Isometric, the leading carbon removal registry. His work involves working with suppliers and building out a suite of high-quality protocols for crediting in pathways like enhanced weathering, BiCRS, and DAC. In his role, he spent a lot of time thinking about how Isometric can leverage high-quality monitoring, reporting, and verification (MRV) to build trust and demand in the voluntary and compliance carbon market. Stacy is Isometric's head of science. This includes ensuring the rigorous science underpin all Isometric's carbon crediting decisions and that protocols and modules are in line with Isometric standard. Stacy was previously head of sustainability at Shopify, where she was responsible for building Shopify's $55 million plus CDR portfolio and was a founding member of Frontier. She also serves on the advisory board of Carbon Removal Canada and Collaborative Fund, a venture capital firm. She has a background in environmental engineering and public policy, with 20 years of experience working at the intersection of science and regulation in both the private and public sector. Neil, Stacy, welcome. Whenever you're ready, please turn on your video, introduce yourself, and take it away.
Awesome, thanks. I think our video is on, so yeah, it's good to be here. Long-time listener, first-time presenter. So yeah, thrilled to get the opportunity to share a bit more about Isometric with everyone. Maybe starting from the beginning. So we want to give a bit of background today on isometric, what quality means, and how we actually go about trying to operationalize that. And so I'm going to give a bit of background on isometric and then pass over to Stacy to give a bit more kind of in the weeds overview. So for those who are maybe less familiar, Isometric is a registry for durable carbon removal, started in 2022. And we have the mission of helping carbon removal scale both responsibly and quickly. And we do that by setting rigorous standards, which typically takes the form of protocols, and then helping suppliers kind of operationalize those protocols, and then ultimately issuing credits on our registry. And the problem that we were set up to solve is, I'm sure it kind of won't be news to many people on this call, but in 2022, we felt like there were a lot of issues with the kind of incumbent voluntary carbon market. A lot of leading companies were wanting to do the right thing and wanting to move towards their, let's say, net zero commitments. And to do that, ultimately, most of them would have to buy at least a portion of carbon credits. But how to actually leverage your dollars for climate action was quite challenging. And we really view what the problem we're trying to solve is the issue of credibility. And so we saw that generally there was a lack of trust in the market. And we feel like partly this was down to potentially protocols that were kind of too open-ended, but also around conflicting incentives and really allowing suppliers to both pick and pay the verifiers that they want to use. Kind of ultimately, we feel leads to perverse incentives and potentially a race to the bottom in terms of quality. And beyond those two things, generally the carbon markets are very inscrutable. We shouldn't necessarily need buyers to be able to dig into the weeds on everything, but it was very challenging to actually understand kind of, did the project that you bought or did the credit that you buy actually have climate impact? And then maybe just focusing on more specifically the types of removals, but when we were founded, almost none of the pathways that we operated in had any protocol that they could credit under. And so we really felt like there was this ability for us to both raise the game for the general carbon market, but also specifically help that style of company get to credits and ultimately get to demand. And so how did we go about trying to actually do this? We were founded on these three core pillars: scientific rigor, aligned incentives, and transparency. Scientific rigor is what I'm going to spend less time talking about. Generally going to pass that over to Stacy to talk a bit more about. But generally, high quality science is the foundation of everything we do here. And really without that, kind of nothing else that we do as a registry is really very meaningful. I mentioned this kind of conflicting incentive model. And one thing that some people on the call might be familiar with is that Isometric has a quite different business model. We're a buyer pays registry. And what that means is that we've really tried to decouple our own financial incentives from the suppliers that we work with and from the number of credits that we issue. In the same way that you don't want the defendant paying the jury if they're on trial, I'm not saying suppliers are on trial, but there are parallels there, that you really want to try and disintermediate a financial relationship. And so we spend a lot of time trying to do that. And then the last thing, which I'll come back to in a second, is transparency. And so for transparency, we really want it to be the case that people, and by people I mean, policymakers or academics or local communities even, can really interrogate what happened in the removal activity. Kind of why was it 100 tons issued and not 150 or 50? And what might be the kind of wider implications for their communities? And so it's kind of a well and good having a set of core founding principles, but it's also important that people care about them and that the market ultimately, market generally defined, kind of reacts to them. And so we've seen that there has been a lot of uptake. So Isometric was the first registry to go through the enhanced ICROA procedures at the end of last year. And so we're now ICROA endorsed. We are also the only registry to be designated as leading for Frontier, which means that we've gone through a kind of lengthy kind of review process with them. And generally that's kind of a fantastic endorsement to see. And people are transacting. So I mentioned this different business model that we have, but it's a business model that leading suppliers like Charm and Volt and InPlanet are working under. It's a business model that leading buyers like JP Morgan Chase, Stripe, and Shopify have all transacted against. The logos on the screen, these were from the recent announcement of the first third-party verified Charm tons. And so we've really managed to have this quite deep relationship with many of the leading players in the space, which has been fantastic. And then I think if I click, so one thing I wanted to talk about is the transparency point, because I think this is something that we've really tried to actually spend a lot of time thinking about. How do you make carbon removals tangible? And what you can see on screen is the fact that when we issue a carbon credit, it's not just a number, it comes attached with all the relevant life cycle analysis information to figure out why was that the number of tons issued. And we don't really expect every buyer to go and look at what were the process emissions for your August deliveries. But that's also not really the point. The point here is that we are putting our homework on display in a way that you can go and interrogate, and you can really go and try and understand. And so, it's all well and good us saying that we're trying to do high quality science or we've written a high quality protocol, but it's a very different thing to actually enable the public to kind of go and inspect that. And then just before passing on to Stacy, one of the other things we've really tried to bake into everything we do is an emphasis on speed. One of the core issues, apart from the kind of the credit quality that maybe didn't take into account durability or didn't take into account additionality as much as it should, was that suppliers were just finding it very slow to get validated, to be verified. And so we've taken that as a kind of challenge for our company to figure out, how can we really work with suppliers, with VVBs, through software, through other processes, to actually really speed up both the time to issuance and the cadence of issuance itself. 1/3 of our team is software engineers. And so this is a kind of core competency that we think you really get benefits from if you internalize wanting to do that well as a registry and wanting to be able to both deliver kind of rigor, but rigor at the speed that the suppliers need and that ultimately the kind of climate itself needs. So that was a bit of a background on Isometric. I'm going to pass over to Stacy now to go a bit more into the weeds on that kind of key area of scientific rigor. So Stacy, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Neil. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the science that underpins the registry system and provides that rigor that we're looking for in terms of providing high quality carbon credits on our platform. So the three principles I'm going to focus on are durability, additionality, and quantification. So for durability, we want to quantify that by understanding the nature of the storage reservoir, by assessing the likelihood and severity of potential reversal events. And very importantly, we also consider the uncertainty around that and what we want in terms of post-project monitoring. So when we look at reversal risk, we incorporate conservative risk discount factors into our protocols that are specifically designed to address these areas of concern so that we can try to ensure that we're not over-crediting. For additionality, essentially, we try to answer whether the carbon removal would have otherwise occurred without the project and the purchase of a carbon removal credit. So to assess additionality, we use counterfactual scenarios, which is inherently a little bit different from your traditional avoidance credits, which are often based on predictions about emissions that may otherwise have occurred. Whereas with the carbon removal credit, the kind that Isometric issues on our registry, it's about taking carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere, capturing it and locking it away. And so based on that, we then go to develop quantification frameworks. And basically our quantification frameworks enable us to determine how much carbon has been removed from the atmosphere. And we're looking for statistically significant signs of carbon removal in our frameworks. So each protocol contains specifications on the measurements and modeling that's needed to determine the carbon fluxes, as well as including and assessing the process emissions and potential leakage. And this data structure is used also, once it's developed, it's used at the verification stage to determine both the quantity and durability of the tons removed by a specific project. And so one thing to note here that's important about the quantification framework is that this also includes guidelines on how to make sure that we're considering uncertainty, parameterization, and sensitivity analysis in the quantification framework so that we can accommodate a range of uncertainty depending on the kind of carbon removal we're talking about. And we always try to take the lower bound in order to make sure that we're being conservative. So ultimately, what we're talking about when we're issuing credits and what's in a protocol that is critical, it's all about defining and then following a formula. The underlying equations ensure that net negativity has taken place and that a credit represents meaningful climate impact. The protocol specifies both how each of these items are calculated, as well as the applicable systems boundaries, and this then clearly delineates the project scope that must be quantified. The combination of scientific rigor and transparency is all about ensuring that every credit always equals a ton of CO2 genuinely and durably removed from the atmosphere. The most important thing in all of this is making sure that uncertainty is factored into that credit. That's what makes it a durable, persistent ton that buyers can rely on. And it's important to note that certainty varies. Measurements in DAC, that's a little bit more certain than, say, carbon removal coming from ocean alkalinity enhancement. But one of the things that we also like to work towards alongside protocol development is trying to figure out how to include all types of measurement, including statistical analysis, to ensure that all pathways have credits that are fungible and that buyers can rely on, that a ton is a ton. So you might be wondering what's involved in our protocol development process. So let's take a quick look here. So the first thing that we do is we start from first principles by gathering information, data, and up-to-date science related to a supplier's process. Then we compile everything we've learned and we begin to formulate a draft protocol. And this draft is written by our highly specialized science team that's able to really dive in and draw upon a lot of their PhD and postdoc experience in these areas of carbon removal. And so we develop those draft protocols. Next step is we take our draft protocol and we engage with the wider CDR ecosystem to get early feedback on both the scientific approach, but also the operational realities of the protocol requirements. So that's why we involve a wide range of stakeholders before finalizing the draft of the protocol. We want to understand, can the protocol be implemented? What are the potential costs associated with it? But we also want to make sure that we're putting forth the most rigorous scientific standards so that we can reliably issue credits that buyers rely on. Once we've gotten all that feedback, we finalize our draft protocol and prepare it for a 30-day public consultation period. And the results of this consultation period and the comments we receive will inform the final version of the protocol. So at the end of that 30-day public consultation, we finalize our protocol and we do what's called certification, which is basically we've now got an official version of the protocol and we're ready to issue credits from a supplier's project following the rules laid out in this final protocol. Alongside the certified protocol, we also publish a summary of the public comments that were received during the comment period. Now, one of the really unique features about Isometric's approach, and this is something that developed over time as we started to expand our protocol offerings, is we realized that our end-to-end protocols that provide all of the rules and guidelines for quantifying and conducting carbon removal for a supplier's specific process could be broken up into modules. And now we're realizing that a lot of suppliers have variations of, say their traditional approach, but they're going to use a different feedstock or they're going to use a different storage reservoir. So what we've developed is we've kind of blown up the traditional protocol approach, and now we have a modular approach where essentially you can choose your own adventure to make your protocol. You can pick the feedstock modules that apply to your process. You can pick the process module that applies and then the storage module that applies, and these can interconnect together to give a supplier an end-to-end protocol on the Isometric platform to issue credits against. And to go to what Neil talked about a bit earlier about the speed we're trying to do this at, is if we wrote end-to-end bespoke protocols for every supplier solution out there in carbon removal, it would certainly take a long time. But there are these commonalities that allow us to take a modular approach where rather than writing a brand new protocol when there's a new supplier with a new approach or a new project location, you can just swap in a new storage module depending on where the CO2 is actually going to go at the end of the day. So it's a really cool approach, and we're building it out now. To date, we have 5 fully certified protocols. You'll see those up there with nice icons. We've got DAC and 4 others. And then you'll also see the four protocols that we just wrapped up public consultations on and are finalizing in advance of certification. And then, as I said earlier, once a protocol is certified, we're ready to issue credits. And now I believe I'm going to hand this back over to Neil to wrap it up.
Awesome, thank you. So generally, we've tried to take a pretty first principles view about each of these different steps in the process. So how could we redo protocol development itself? How could we redo the actual verification process? How can we re-architect the registry for greater transparency? And then how can we think about a different approach to kind of monitoring and reversal risk? And so in each of these areas, we've really tried to hone in on what would be the best way of doing this to set the ecosystem up for basically maximum credibility over the long run, because we think unless you can get both speed and credibility, the whole ecosystem is going to suffer, and it's going to kind of slow the progress we want to make. And so a kind of last slide here about how to get involved. So if you're a buyer, we are always happy to talk to you about kind of carbon removal purchases that you're looking to make. We obviously have a high opinion of suppliers who are using our protocols. We design the science they're going to be crediting under. So always do get in touch. If you're a supplier, I'm happy to kind of talk with you. We try and move, as I mentioned, very quickly to be able to get suppliers through the process. We're able to be kind of fairly flexible about prioritizing new types of pathways where it makes sense. And so, do get in touch on there as well. And I guess importantly, while Stacy mentioned we have an in-house science team, this is not something we do in a silo. We have maybe 12 PhDs on staff, but there are a staggeringly larger number of other people with relevant expertise in the wider ecosystem. We have a science network, which is about 200 people strong, and those are all kind of experts in various forms of carbon removal science. You can join and apply to join that, and those are often people that we kind of first look to potentially bring in at the earlier stage of protocol consultation. And we're also open to research partnerships. We have research partnerships with national labs, with NGOs, and with kind of other academic institutions. So wherever it makes sense and wherever it's able, we think, to kind of accelerate the pathways that we work in forward, very happy to get in touch and kind of collaborate on that. And I believe that wraps things up. So thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Thanks, guys. That was a great presentation. I will start us off with a few questions that kind of come from the OpenAir community, and then looks like we're already getting a few questions in the chat, which Tank will get to. So first question, which I like to just start off everyone who presents with, is how did you kind of what was your personal journey into CDR and kind of working on this area? And maybe I'll start with you, Stacy, and then Neil, you can go next.
Sure. So my journey started, I would say, about 7 or 8 years ago. I was working for the Canadian government for the Department of the Environment, and was becoming more and more aware of, the Paris Agreement negotiations and the things that were ongoing in that regard, and got somewhat concerned with, emissions reduction targets not necessarily happening, and started doing my own personal research on well, what else could we do? What else can we do? And I'm an engineer by training and love technology, and started to think about solutions, and got lucky enough to stumble across a job posting at Shopify to build out their carbon removal procurement program, their sustainability fund. Took that on at the end of 2019, and learned so much and signed 40 suppliers, and then came to a bit of a conclusion where it's well, this is great. We've got all these projects and suppliers, but we need to quantify this. And I started to conclude that if carbon removal is going to scale, then we need a robust registry to issue those credits on. And Isometric is where I am now.
Great. Neil, what about you?
I actually got into carbon removal through economics. So my background's in economics, and I had a particular interest in kind of market shaping mechanisms at like quite an abstract level. And so I was actually doing research and writing about advanced market commitments. And there aren't that many, so advanced market commitments where you kind of pre-commit to purchase a certain product if it meets a criteria. It's kind of what the thesis of Frontier is. And at the time I was doing that, there were kind of examples in global health and vaccines. And then it was just after the kind of first set of strike purchases. And so kind of carbon removal was kind of the other area that this was kind of being worked in. And I think global health is wonderful, obviously incredibly important. But I was just more excited by kind of getting into carbon removal. And so started to kind of go more into the weeds on kind of other economic areas like techno-economic analysis, kind of cost curves, and generally did that for a bit, but wanted to kind of join an organization that was both going to be very horizontal. So I didn't necessarily want to be tied to a specific technology, but also very technical. And maybe more so than just those two things, given the background on market shaping, but was going to be able to play a role in general market shaping of the carbon removal ecosystem. And I don't think there were that many other organizations other than Isometric that really tick all those boxes to the same extent. And so, yeah, it met Eamon, was a good fit, and yeah, been very, very happy here for kind of almost the last 2 years now.
Great. And yeah, just maybe on the kind of, the inception of Isometric, it's one of the few registries out there that's really focused on, carbon removal specifically, not avoidance or not anything else. Can you just talk about maybe some of the challenges and some of the advantages of being in that position? Kind of seems like Isometric's moved really fast and gotten a lot done in a short period of time, but obviously must have started a lot from scratch. So I'm curious to hear kind of those unique dynamics from whichever one of you wants to take that one.
Go for it, Neil. You were there.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the challenges are, carbon removal is still, if we're all very frank and honest with ourselves, a fairly small sector. That was even more true in like 2022. There had been maybe less than 10 companies that have ever delivered, and that was all off registry anyway. So one of the challenges is just our role is maybe less, it's less like a tech company that's just trying to take a large part of a large market. It's really also having to kind of help to grow the market itself, which is just a lot of different responsibilities than just what a typical kind of registry might be involved in. In terms of the benefits of focusing on kind of removals from the beginning, I think a large part of that was just focus. Focus and mission maybe. So, this was a section of companies that almost had nowhere else that they could go. And so to the extent that we thought they would be important, and we felt that strongly, it was quite easy to get kind of excited about trying to support them scale. And then on the focus standpoint, we have around 12 scientists now. It's been, I would say, generally easier to have scientists that, even if you're an enhanced weathering scientist, it actually turns out you have a lot of transferable skills into other types of weathering or mineralization, for example. That's maybe less true if you're thinking about renewable energy kind of avoidance projects. Those kind of crossovers are less present. And so I think the ability to kind of focus and kind of build up kind of cross-functional science team was also a big kind of benefit.
Yeah, definitely. And just in terms of you talk a lot about establishing quality carbon credits, which I think is super important at this early stage. Like you say, we need to build trust in the public in carbon removal. I'm kind of hearing a lot of different organizations weighing in on that right now. And I'm curious to know how and if you think we'll coalesce around a definition of what quality really means in this industry.
Oh, that's a fun question. I think at the long term, long time scales, there will be a convergence around that definition, and it will likely be regulated globally, right? We'll get there, I think, in time, but that's a long way off. And so today, the focus is on trying to put out protocols and modules and methodologies that hit that high bar of scientific rigor and really take into account the uncertainties that can be there when we're talking about early stage projects where, you need a little bit more research and you need to get bigger data sets. And like it's early days, like Neil said, in some of the carbon removal solutions that are out there. So it's really about the two sides coming together, where the suppliers are doing their best work on the project side, and then buyers really want to be able to trust and rely on that credit. And right now, a buyer, it's the voluntary carbon market. There's some guidance out there on what you can do with a credit, and you can retire it against your footprint, right? And that's really the financing mechanism that we have for these projects. So it's about trying to make sure that these protocols are rigorous, transparent, and we're bringing the field along together to hopefully at some point really to have that global framework. But it's a long ways off.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot when I look at the website and hear the way you guys talk. There's a lot of transparency built in, a lot of really specific things you do to bring that level of trust. How do you think about communicating that to the public who's maybe not really looking in such depth into exactly how your protocols are designed or exactly how your data collection and transparency works? Because I think that's obviously a big part of making CDR a more trustworthy thing. And I think most people are not paying this level of attention. So how do you think about that?
Rock, paper, scissors, stone. Go. Sure. It's, when it comes to communicating about CDR, and this is something that, has been happening maybe for 5 years, and we're still on such the early start of developing the sector that the average citizen is unaware of what carbon removal is. Right. And so what we need to do, we have that broad approach where we need to take every platform and every space we can to explain what it is and why it's important. You did a wonderful intro at the beginning of this webinar. That needs to happen all the time, everywhere. But to support that in the longer term, what we need to do is make sure that these early credits that are being issued and these early projects that are being done in novel pathways, we have to do it in a transparent way. We have to explain what we know, but more importantly, we have to explain what we do not know and what the uncertainties and questions are around how to quantify the carbon removal, because we don't want to pretend that, these are way better than, how this is done traditionally in the past. It's, you have to put the information out there so it can be scrutinized. And because it's so early, we have to do that general education piece, but we also really have to put as much information out there as we can for those who want to dig further. And so, also so that when we're 5 years from now, that record is there to be scrutinized, and we will have a market built on a foundation of trust.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, another thing I wanted to ask about was this kind of modular approach that you have been working on and that you talked about a little bit. So I've looked at some of the modules, and it kind of breaks down a pathway and lets you pick and choose pieces that might apply to your approach as a supplier. Is that something that you think you'll reach a point at, eventually where you've kind of built all the modules and then a supplier or project developer is just kind of picking and choosing? Or is it it's going to be constantly developing and new pathways and projects are going to require that, and that's going to be an ongoing thing over time?
You want to take that one, Neil?
Yeah. There are only so many ways that you can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. That being said, there are a surprisingly large number of ways that you can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So I think I do not see the work there slowing down in the immediate term, definitely. I think at some point we will hopefully have made enough progress that almost every supplier that is kind of doing carbon removal at scale is covered by the existing modules. There is a lot of work, though, around... it's one thing kind of to write the requirements in a modular way. There is then, what does it mean to help suppliers be able to implement the different modules? Or what does the process look like to update the modules, right? Because that might look different to different modules. What does it look like for potentially modules to look different based on different regulatory regimes? Mm-hmm. Maybe an EU supplier is going to need and want something different than a US supplier because they want to fit under CRCF versus DOE. Yeah. And so even if it's not necessarily scientific technical detail, I can see a lot of reason that a registry would still need to be very on top of like what other potential changes need to come for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, that makes sense. Just a couple more before I give us over to Tank for the audience questions. So you guys recently announced, and I think you talked about it earlier, that Charm had sold its first verified credits to, I think it was Shopify, Stripe, and JP Morgan through Isometric. These are all, buyers and sellers that have done this before and have kind of done this off registry in the past. So what do you think was kind of the advantage that they're looking for, or what they're sort of looking to do by now going through a registry and doing this in a slightly more formalized way? And do you think that's kind of a step towards maturity in the industry?
Oh, that's a great question. We can't speak on behalf of those buyers, but what we can do is take away some of the differences between this transaction and an off-registry transaction, right? Having some experience on the corporate sustainability side where, we're buying credits and you're retiring those and you're reporting on that, having a public registry listing that you can point to and say, yep, we bought 100 credits, we've retired them, you can go see and scrutinize it. It's a lot more robust in terms of corporate sustainability reporting than just saying, we're carbon neutral, this gives that open record of what somebody bought. In terms of why this was significant, it was, a full verification on Charm Industrial, and then a credit issuance on our platform to 3 buyers. And that certainly is proof that, the buyers are looking for that registry. The suppliers can work with us. And so it's like a proof point of like an end-to-end completion that took place. And it's quite exciting for Isometric as a company, right, on our path to growing and to demonstrating that we're capable of doing this in the market today.
Yeah, definitely. Super exciting.
I think it's just a point about scalability of process here as well. I don't know if Stacy even remembers this, but one of back in kind of 2022, actually, one of the first discussions we had when Isometric was really very early was about, could Isometric actually just support sophisticated buyers to do their internal due diligence just more easily? Like, are there just ways that we could help kind of manage all the LCA files, because Shopify would still have to look at everything? We didn't do that. But, the fact that that was such an issue and such a time suck and required so much specialty skills, I think just generally points to this fact that there have been off-registry transactions, there are sophisticated buyers, but those are not scalable processes. And so really, I think what this transaction also represents is just, a movement away from kind of bespokeness, I guess, to standardization, and ultimately like that is something that we need if we want to be able to do this, not just for Charm and not just once a year, but, once a month for Charm and, tens or hundreds of other suppliers. It's a hard thing for any given buyer to do all the diligence on themselves.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is a huge step towards just standardization and like moving things faster. So yeah, really exciting news on that. Just a couple more before we go. You kind of mentioned this, but on the regulatory side, is there like a particular way that you kind of see yourself interfacing with things like CRCF or any other regulation that comes out where your protocols kind of explicitly interact with those regulations? And then is there any other regulation that you kind of hope to see coming out that's going to make your work easier, other than just like things that standardize what is the standards around CDR a bit more?
I'm going to take that first and then. So generally how we look to be involved in these different efforts is mainly just to offer our experiences. I remember we had a call with the EU maybe last year, and a lot of it was just sharing how long and how challenging and what the process looks like for developing a single protocol. And so I think there's a lot that we try and do there about, you don't need to necessarily start from scratch. We have like some lessons learned in the exact kind of spaces that you might be looking at. And, we're probably thinking about very similar questions like system boundaries for BECS or, sampling requirements for enhanced weathering. And so a lot of how we generally tend to engage is kind of sharing views on how we've approached those questions in the past, because in a lot of questions, there's no scientific answer in like quotes. There's almost a policy question. You could actually decide to do a slightly different thing, and that is a totally legitimate approach. So a lot of it's kind of just experience sharing. In terms of things I'd like to see, I think seeing the kind of next phase of the DOE procurement prize will be very exciting. The DOE and the EU take very different approaches to what standards look like. The EU is going for a kind of methodology first approach. The DOE is kind of going for this procurement first approach. But I think, what the DOE decides to look at for what are the protocols that they might, what is the science that they're going to kind of look to? Are they going to just defer to NOAA on all marine CDR related things? Are they going to kind of look to existing things? I think that's a big one. I'm more bearish on ETS integration, I would say. It's a necessary thing for us to see, and I think the sooner ETS integration can come, that's like a good signal. But it's going to be challenging to get like actually more demand if the strike price in ETS is $20, $50. I wish CDR was that cheap, but that's not really the case today.
Cool. Very last one before I hand it over to Tank. Is there anything that you guys, either you're announcing or just out in the CDR world, that you think is interesting that people should keep an eye out for?
Interesting and keep an eye out for. I mean, I think there's a lot happening right now. One of the things that I think about quite a bit is the allocation of capital and who's going to buy next. I'm curious to see if we get some new joiners into the buyer side of things with the advancement of issuing credits on a registry. Marketplaces are evolving right now, and I think that there may be some more pathways to getting more buyers around the table to give support to the suppliers that are here now. So I think I'm paying attention to that side of the supply and demand equation at the moment.
Sure. Neil, anything else you want to add?
I don't think so, but I think I did see a question about Wave 2 buyers that I think was a very good one, and definitely have thoughts on that.
Yeah,
nothing
that's in a second. All right, then I will hand it over to Tank, and yeah, take it over to audience questions.
All right, thank you, Magga. Okay, so I'm gonna start from the sort of go to the basics of what isometrics do. I think it would be very helpful if you could, based on the comments, if you could help folks wrap our head around how does the products that the team is building improve on incumbent solutions?
Why don't I rattle off a couple things, Neil, and then you can add on. I mean, what we're developing in a lot of cases are protocols and methodologies for carbon removal solutions that don't have industry standard protocols and methodologies that have been trialed before. So some of this is brand new, and what that means is it gives a clear recipe to that pathway on, what are the rules and considerations around making those carbon measurements, that quantification that can then issue credits against. I think that's an important product feature. We're not just doing things that already are in existence. We're creating net new. We also have a lot of, like Neil mentioned, we have an engineering team, and it's really about trying to accelerate and also improve the quality of the data. And so we want to get that data quick. We want to remove human intervention and human inputs that often create typos and errors. We want to be able to get that direct from sensors, from the CDR deployments. And that's going to enable us to, also, I mentioned improve the data quality, but it also means we can do more speedy credit issuances, where it's like instead of every year we issue credits for a supplier or a project, it could be monthly. And so we're really trying to focus on leveraging technology to make sure that those suppliers are selling credits, issuing credits, delivering credits to those buyers and getting paid faster. Because if we can get that to happen quicker, then there's more money moving in the right places to make sure that we get more future carbon removal deployments. So those are two of the things we're doing. Neil, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that I think there's also we've tried to take maybe a different framing on like what a registry's role should be. So I think, many registries, they're involved in kind of convening and delegating. They convene working groups, they delegate verification. And I think we've generally tried to we do those things, obviously, but we've generally also tried to just take more ownership over what does the whole process look like. And, I think at the moment that shows up in the registry design, for example. We build our own registry. That's not true in every case. And that's enabled us to both take a different approach, but also iterate on the approach more quickly. It also shows up, to Stacy's point, in the kind of speed angle, where because we're not delegating what that verification process looks like entirely, we kind of have a view on how we want to improve things like verification. Again, we're able to kind of take action there and iterate to actually make that process work with VVBs and kind of improve that over time. And so I think kind of any process that might be involved in the general verification cycle, I think is one that we've generally tried to take more ownership on ourselves and work with people to actively improve that and kind of improve that kind of at an increasing pace.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to try to blend 3 questions in one and sort of double click on the process of protocol development. So the first question here was like, how long does it take to create a protocol, of a new protocol end to end? And I think, and also the double click, like who does the verification? And also what happens when protocol needs to be updated, and how often are they updated based on, new scientific findings?
All right. So how long does it take to create a new protocol? It varies greatly depending on the CDR pathway, the state of the science, the progress that's already been made in deployments. If there's been multiple pilots, we've got a lot more data. Protocol development might be a little bit quicker, it may not. That may also show a lot of questions that we may still have, and there's more deep research to do. So, there's not really a set time frame for developing a protocol because we want to make sure that we're doing it right. But it can take anywhere from 8 months to, if it's a module where we're tweaking and adding a new kind of feedstock or say a new storage approach, it could be 2 months. It could be a couple of weeks. It really just depends on the scope and the state of the science. So it does vary. And what we try to do is make sure that we understand the timelines of our suppliers when they are going to be doing their first deployments, when they're going to be delivering credits to buyers. And we want to make sure that we do the best we can to accommodate that. We're not going to work in a glass castle and take years to develop a protocol when there's a carbon removal deployment that needs to happen. We try to prioritize those efforts in the right place. So that was the first part of the question. I remember the last part, which was what happens when the science evolves and how do we update the protocols. So maybe I'll talk about that, and then Tank, you can remind me about the middle. So when science evolves, or we learn something from a credit issuance with a supplier, or some kind of other input, what we do is we have quite a nimble platform where we can go out and we will update the protocol or the module. It'll go back out. If it's a material change, it'll go back out for a 30-day public consultation. There's notifications you can sign up for. So if you're super interested in our energy use accounting module, and we go out with a draft update, you'll get an email about that. You can weigh in. Then we do that 30-day consultation and revise and certify another version. So if you go on the registry, you can actually see, version 1.0, version 1.2, version 2. It just depends on what's being updated, whether it'll be, a subversion or a full new version. So that's what happens for the updating. And really, it's just as it makes sense and we want to update those requirements because we've learned more, we should do it.
Okay. Yeah. Neil, do you have anything to add, or I'll just quickly remind you. The second question is about verification. So who actually does the verification?
I'm happy to take that quickly. So we have a kind of roster of validation verification bodies, so VVBs. They go through an initial vetting process, and then they are the kind of third parties that we then use to kind of actually do the verification. They'll do physical site visits. I think we have 6 or 7 that gone through the process today. And, generally they have to have demonstrated a level of expertise in given areas. If they're verifying a pathway that's fairly new, we'll help to kind of staff them up or kind of help them find the right set of people to do the verifications in these kind of more nascent technical areas.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to one question that two people had was about managing uncertainties. So how do you think? What is your approach about managing uncertainties or uncertainty factors for crediting or for calculation?
I can start with that. At a very high level, it's about that rule, going back and making sure that one credit is 1 ton. And we have a variety of pathways with different uncertainty considerations. And so what we do is a very rigorous statistical analysis, a sensitivity analysis to ensure that we're providing the right uncertainty discounts to the right parameters so that when we do a verification or the VVBs do the verification and we get that number and they followed our methodology, we can rely on that credit and know that it's not been over-credited. And so we always take that conservative approach and make sure that we've done those uncertainty discounts for all of the different considerations across all the pathways. Neil might be able to give a more specific example of where this was like interesting or maybe a little bit spicy. But like in general, it's a principled approach to make sure that at this early stage, we don't overcredit. And, as we get more deployments, those uncertainty discounts are going to naturally shrink as the data set gets bigger, right? So we expect that to evolve.
I think generally we've also just taken an approach to start in the more certain areas and iterate. This is like particularly true, for instance, in biomass approaches. We have a fairly restrictive and narrow set of feedstocks that we feel, if you're able to qualify, really confident about the kind of LCA implications, leakage, counterfactual analysis for those feedstocks. There are lots of biomass feedstocks that might be reasonable things to use for CDR that kind of don't qualify. And that's generally because what we really want to avoid, right, is writing a protocol where you could follow the letter of the protocol, but not necessarily like the spirit of the protocol, and introduce pathways where there was just more uncertainty than we would actually feel comfortable with if we'd kind of considered that up front. And so, another example of this is with enhanced weathering. We have a statistical test for sampling, but we also have a minimum sampling requirement. And that's because we generally haven't been convinced by kind of the ecosystem's ability to deal with kind of in-field heterogeneity. And so one way around that is to just have a certain amount of spatial sampling, even if that's more than you would in theory need just for a statistical basis. And so there are some areas where we've just taken the view that a particular kind of uncertainty is one that we actually just want to start quite conservative on. And then as knowledge grows and as we spend more time in the space, we can expand over time.
Okay, all right, thank you. One question here around ERW, and it's about that measurement and analysis of protocols could be cost prohibitive for a smaller supplier. So what is the approach that Isometric has taken to ensure that it's inclusive of smaller suppliers when it comes to ERW?
This is a tough one because, we just talked about the answer around uncertainty and sampling minimums in the previous question, right? And it's really about making sure that we're able to issue credits that have that uncertainty. We're not over-crediting a project because we want to maintain that trust. That being said, it's really important to meet the field where it's at. It's very important to enable suppliers to go do small-scale deployments and learn. And that's really important for the field. So, there's a lot to consider for ERW. And, our scientists are continually evolving their thinking around this and making sure that we're thinking about the geographical differences that can take place and how much sampling can cost in certain jurisdictions versus others. So, I don't have the answer for this, but I think what's important to take away is that it's definitely being considered, and we want to make sure that we have protocols out there that are globally applicable, but also enable deployments and innovation to take place. Because if we have too restrictive a protocol, you don't get a deployment, and then there's no carbon removal. So we kind of defeat ourselves. I'm sure Neil wants to add a little bit there.
I would just maybe slightly challenge the premise. I think this is particularly true in enhanced weathering, where when we were first getting involved, there were a lot of suppliers we spoke to who were really looking to do a very low sampling, kind of costless based MRV method. And it wasn't actually the case that there were a lot of buyers out there who were, it was like Isometric had a more expensive sampling regime, or they could do a cheaper sampling regime and access the same buyers. A lot of the buyers we were speaking to, they just didn't trust that lower sampling regime. And so, there was one buyer we spoke to who said, I want to deploy kind of $10 million plus into enhanced weathering, but I don't trust any of the MRV I see in the market today. And so in that world, I think there is this question of cost, but there's also this question of demand. And if the cost and the MRV that you do enables you to actually access, an order of magnitude more demand, which I really think is the case in enhanced weathering today, then I guess is trying to reduce the specific cost per ton the right metric to be maximizing.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Next question here is around if you could provide more details on how Isometric identifies and evaluates potential partners for carbon removal technologies, and are there technologies that are of your specific focus?
Happy to say that. So generally, if you're operating in a pathway that we already have a protocol for, that's a very simple answer. I'm happy to speak to you. And that's kind of I won't go back over, I think, almost 9 now, but they were on the screen earlier. If you're outside of that, it becomes a bit more qualitative. So, there are pathways that we're currently looking at where we don't have a protocol. It would require new scientific work on our side. And the way we evaluate that is, a bit of a holistic mix between, well, are you similar to one of the pathways we've already done? So Stacy mentioned, in some cases, it might just be a storage module that needs to change. That's a kind of lower lift. There's a question about the kind of potential of the pathway. And then, do you actually have you kind of done some work on your side around what the MRV for this kind of missing piece might look like? And so there are pathways where, we work with suppliers. We thought the pathway was promising. They had buyers that wanted to kind of purchase carbon credits. And they'd also done work on their side to say, well, we think the MRV would look a bit like this. And then we were able to at least have a kind of initial thing to go off. So I think those are like some of the factors, but it's similar to the protocol timeline question Stacy answered, which is it does depend and it can vary based on the supplier type.
Okay, cool. All right, here's another interesting one, I think. Corey asked, what are your thoughts on secondary markets and speculations as a potential demand driver for CDR? Are Isometric purchase always retired upon issuance, or is retirement at the discretion of the supplier or buyer?
Happy to take this one.
It's kind of 2 questions, but definitely happy for you to take the lead on it.
I guess the short answer to this is there are some accounts where it's retire on delivery, but generally that's the buyer discretion. Most of the pathways we operate in are not very amenable to secondary markets. Biochar is maybe a different case, but generally in the other pathways, you're expecting a decreasing cost curve. That's not a very attractive thing to kind of buy now and hold for later. And so I think secondary markets are not wonderfully well suited to that setup unless you can do some incredible volume discount. But I think that's a pretty challenging thing to make work. It doesn't go against any of the mechanisms of our model, but it's not something we've really seen kind of take off in a meaningful way.
Okay, and now one last question before I let you go. This question is about the second wave of buyers. Yeah, where do you think this, beyond what we already have in the first big wave of buyers, big corporate commitments, where do you think the second wave of buyers will come from?
I wish I had a crystal ball. I think there's 2 places that I hope they come from. I hope it's government procurement. And the reason I hope it's government procurement is because that can also be standard setting. If it's good enough for the DOE purchase price, then it's good enough for most corporate buyers. So what that'll do as a market signal is hopefully bring in new corporate buyers who want to buy carbon removal and give them the assurance that, yeah, this is a good credit to retire against your footprint and your emissions, and to give that like market assurance. So I think that would be nice as a second wave buyer. But I think the wave will really come when we get clarity on the quality of a credit that you're allowed to retire as a corporate buyer against your emissions, when we get some more stringent rules in the from ICVCM and for the voluntary market in terms of that retirement component and what kinds of credits are allowed for what. Then we'll see the next wave of buyers come in, and that will obviously be the corporates who have not yet participated, who potentially have very big footprints to address.
I think I would flag two slightly different areas to attach to that. One of them would be when the Green Claims Directive is more clarified. It's very related to what Stacey mentioned, but maybe on the compliance side, or not necessarily compliance, but the policy kind of stamp. And then the other group would just be pre-compliance buyers. So you have like compliance markets, your kind of regulated into buying CDR, your voluntary markets. But I do think there are these number of companies that fit in the pre-compliance lens. So airlines would be a good example of this, where they're kind of knowing that they're going to end up being forced to buy CDR probably. Like, they're going to struggle to reduce their emissions. It is difficult for them to get away with just purchasing nature-based removals forever. And so I think we might see more industries like that pull forward their demand. You know, to date, CDR has maybe been too small for them to really do much in, but you're not necessarily looking for them to have deliveries in the next few years. But what you do want to see, and what I think will potentially be more likely, is that they pull forward the offtake contracts to get in people's order books now. Because if you wait until 2030 to get into someone's order book, there's a real chance that you might just be closed out from doing that. So I think this would be the two I'd look at.
All right, thank you for your very insightful answers. I'll hand it over to Magga.
Yeah, thanks guys for joining us. This has been really great. Just to close us out, for everyone watching, we will be announcing new episodes soon. So keep an eye out on Luma or LinkedIn, wherever you normally look. And yeah, we've got a couple of things in the works, so hopefully we'll be back to you soon. See you next time. Thanks so much for being here.